I created a new file in this main file, which I'm going to change the name of it now to player_roster classes. Okay. And I have three Java files in here. One that contains only the main method, one that contains my player class, and the other that contains my roster class. So on Monday, we discussed the player class, which we determined has a few attributes. It has every player object has a name, position, and salary. And then the player class has a count variable. This is a static variable. It belongs to the class. It does not belong to each individual player. Okay, again, the problem with that is if the count belonged to each player object would have its own count. And that could be fine depending on the context of what the count represents. Now, we said that the count represents how many players there are in the class, how many player objects there are, and thus we want that to be a static variable because it represents how many there are of something for the entire class, not how many there are of something for a specific player, okay? And then we went through and we wrote the implementation for the constructor. And then we wrote a couple of methods: get name, get position, get salary, get count, raise salary, and then we wrote a toString method there as well. So now on to the roster class. Okay, so now on to the roster class. We're going to be using array list in this roster class. So your first line of code should be, your first lines of code should be any imports that you're going to be using. So I have import java.util.ArrayList. I could also use java.util.star, which imports many things, but also includes the ArrayList package, okay? You were asked to declare a new class named roster. So we start off public class roster, pretty straightforward there. We were then told to examine the 2010 APCSA exam FRQ number 1. So let's go ahead and do that real quick. So if we take a look at the first question, and this is an FRQ that we did together in class a couple of weeks ago, we can observe that we have this cookie order class. And the cookie order class, or I should say a cookie order object, has two attributes. It has a string and an int. The string is the variety or the name of the cookie, and then the int is how many boxes of that cookie type are going to be in that cookie order. And then there are methods that correspond to getting each of these values. After that, we find ourselves examining another class called master order. And what we can observe here is that the master order class, or a master order object, has a relationship with a cookie order object, or the cookie order class. And notice that after the class declaration, our first line of code is a private instance variable. The variable is called orders, and the order list or order array list is of type cookie order. Similarly, we are going to have a private instance variable called team, and the team is an array list of players. Okay, it's not an array list of strings, it's not an array list of integers, it's not an array list of booleans or doubles. It's an array list of players, player objects. And if you're not sure what that is, then you have to go back to the player class and examine what exactly is a player object. What attributes does a player object contain? Okay. In addition to that, we're told that we need a payroll variable and we need a salary cap variable, and we're to set that salary cap to 2 million. Okay. After that, we need our constructor, where we're going to initialize these variables. Now, notice that the salary cap was initialized to 2 million. I guess you can initialize that in the roster constructor, but there's really no need to do that because the salary cap is for the entire it's consistent throughout the class. But you know what? It's not static, so we can do it inside of here as well if you like, and we can play around with that to see how things might change if we were to initialize it in the constructor rather than initialize it up here, okay? So we have public roster. We have to initialize the team to a list that has size 0. So this is an important line of code that if we left out, we would have run into many errors and probably gotten quite frustrated. So we can actually see that in the FRQ as well. Right here in the master order constructor, we can see that the orders list is being initialized to this new array list of cookie order objects with the open close parentheses. And what this represents is that we now have a list of size 0. Okay, so it's been declared here, it's been initialized here, and then later on we're going to add orders to the list. We're going to actually fill it up. Okay, and we'll do that momentarily in our example as well. So we're going to have a couple of methods that belong to the roster class. We have this method called addPlayer, and the parameter for the addPlayer method is a player object. So when you use the addPlayer method, you are going to, in parentheses, specify the player object or a player object that gets added to the list, which is the roster. Okay, again, so to summarize what we've talked about so far, a roster object is simply a list, okay, or an array list of player objects. And in order to add those objects to the roster, we have to identify which player we would like to add to the roster, okay? And team, which is the name of our list, dot add the player, okay? So we're adding the player to the list. And then similarly, we have the remove player, method and team.remove the player. Then we have a getTotalPayroll method. So the total is initialized to 0.0. And in order to calculate the total payroll, we need to get each individual salary from each individual player object. So there's really two parts to this in the body. First, you need to get the player object from the list. Then you need to invoke the getSalary method, which belongs to the player class, in order to get that salary from that player object. Okay, and you're going to be adding that to the total each time as you loop through the list. Now, as it stands in our main method, we only have 2 players that we created. That was LeBron and A. Davis. And then finally, it'll return that total. Okay. If we want to print the roster, so print all of the members of the team, I changed things up here a little bit. So rather than using the standard for loop, I thought it would be good for us to practice using the for each loop. So when we invoke the print roster method, so we would say something like Lakers, which is the team, Lakers.print roster. First, it's going to print the 2020 roster, and then beneath it, it's going to print each player element in the team list. So for each element in team, print that element, okay? Print that element. And then finally, we have a cap space method that determines how much cap space there is, or how much money we have in salary left over based on this salary cap. So if every team has $2 million to spend, then how much money do we have left over based on the players that we currently have on the roster? So we declare a variable cap space, and this is simply the difference between the salary cap, the $2 million, and getting the total payroll. And then we print total cap space, and then whatever this number is calculated to be, depending on when we take away the total payroll from the salary cap. So if we go to the main method and we'll go ahead and run this, notice we have a roster object called Lakers. Next up, I've added a player to the team list, which is Lakers. So since LeBron was already instantiated as a player object earlier in the main method, right up here, that's already done as a part of last week's activity, or earlier this week's activity. Similarly, we added another player in A. Davis. I then printed out the Lakers 2020 payroll concatenated with Lakers.getTotalPayroll, and we can observe that right here. So Lakers 2020 payroll is $532,501 and approximately 37 cents, which makes sense because that's the sum of this number here, which is LeBron's salary, and this number here, which is Anthony Davis's salary. So 312,500 plus 220,000 with the change gives us the 532,501 and approximately 37 cents. Then after that, we invoked the print roster method, which should print all of the player objects that are in the list. So notice it says 2020 roster, and then it prints each player object. It doesn't simply just print their name, although we could do that if we wanted to. It prints the entire player object, and that is because in the player class, we have this toString method. So when you say, now whenever you say, please print a player object, it's going to print the person's name, their position, and their salary, which is exactly what was displayed right here, okay? So again, in the roster, give me a second. In the print roster method, for each element in the team list, print that element. So by simply just saying the print the element, it's going to print all of the information about that element. And because we have a toString method in the player class, that when you print the element, it's going to invoke this method automatically, okay? And we could change that so that it prints just the player's name rather than all the information about the player object, but we would then have to change the print roster method. And perhaps instead of using a for each loop, maybe we just use the regular for loop, and we would have to say, we would have to use the get name method from the player class in order to just have the name being displayed as opposed to all of the information about a player object, okay? And then finally, Lakers.capSpace. So down here at the bottom, notice it says total cap space colon with a space, and then it has the value which represents the sum of the 2020 payroll, which is 532,501. This number down here, the total cap space, reflects 2 million minus this number here, and you can confirm that on your own if you have a little calculator or you want to type it in a Google calculator or something like that, but it is in fact the correct number that should be there. Okay, so I'm going to go back to Google Classroom real quick, or Google Conference, and of course I can go back to the code at any time, but I'm going to just take some questions from you and see what you are thinking. All right. Tanmim, the 2010 FRQ Q1 is about the player, okay? It's about the relationship between the player and roster classes. There's a strong similarity between the cookie order and master order example. I wasn't saying that I didn't take the player class and I made it up on my own. I'm simply saying that there's a strong connection between the two. So if you examine the 2010 FRQ, it was meant to help you in your effort to write the roster class, because it has the same type of has a relationship that the cookie order and master order classes have. Similarly, the roster class and the player class, they have a relationship one another. Not only that, the roster class, a roster object is a list. It's a list of players in the same way that a master order is a list of cookie orders, okay? So there were some strong similarities there. Victor, if you just use JDoodle, you should simply write a new class out of the player class, but in creating the roster class, simply write class instead of public class, for example. Yep, I think that should work. Thanks, Vic. I think that's the same way that it works with JCreator as well. I didn't know what remove player was supposed to do, so I kind of made it complicated. Okay, I mean, there weren't, there were guidelines of how to build this class, but certainly not strict guidelines. It wasn't, it wasn't the same. When we do these little mini projects together, it's not the same as when we do an actual FRQ from old AP exams. It's meant for there to be some creativity on your part. So not everybody is going to have the same solution. So that's okay, Matthew, if yours was far more complicated than than the one that I had. Are there any questions? Anything that you'd like to see when I pull it back up? Okay, I'm just looking at how do you import classes. So you would write import, so you would say like public class master order imports. So it would be, you'd have it right after the master order, okay? Or in this case, public class player import, and then whatever class you're importing from. But Matthew, I don't think that's something that you need. If it's something you want to experiment with, that's fine. But the imports, when you import from one class to another, that's something that's brought up with the topic of abstract classes, and that's not going to be covered. That they may have even removed that topic from the course altogether, but it was covered, I believe, in chapter 9, the chapter that we had been working on prior to us learning that chapter 9 was no longer going to be covered on the exam. Okay. Let me look at what Jia Yi has here. Roster.getIndex dot equals the player. Index remove. That looks like it would work, Jia Yi. Very nice. Anything else that you'd like to see? I can go back, take questions. I'll post this when we're done with our conference. That looks like that would work also, Matthew. I'll be interested to insert that into my own code and check and see how that works. Hi, Clementina. What about the remove player? When you say remove player, please, what do you mean by that? Yeah. I didn't even use the remove. The remove player method is not necessary. I just kind of, I didn't even use it in the main method. In fact, that's not really a good practice. So what I should do here real quick is double check and see that it works. So I'm going to go back myself and just type out Lakers dot remove player and then the player's name. So we'll remove A. Davis, okay, and then reprint the roster. Okay, so it did work successfully. Notice here that a call to the print roster in line 35 printed out the 2020 roster, and then it printed both the information about the LeBron James object, player object, as well as the Anthony Davis object. And a call to Lakers.capspace in line 38 printed the total cap space right here. And then we said Lakers.remove player A. Davis. Okay, the return type there of that method, remove player, is void. So it didn't print anything, it just did something behind the scenes. So then a subsequent call of Laker to the print roster method, Lakers.print roster. Notice now that the roster is just 2020 roster, and now it's only LeBron James. The A. Davis player object was removed from the roster. So my remove player method worked successfully as I intended it to. Okay, so I'll go back to it. So here's the add player method and the remove player method. Yes, I'll post the code after the conference. You're welcome. All right, so one of the things I'm going to start doing, so our next activity won't be you writing code in Replit or JDoodle or whatever. I'm going to start reassigning work from the AP Classroom. So your next assignment will be to complete multiple choice questions from Chapter 2 in the AP Classroom. So after our meeting today, I'm going to reassign those to you. And that will be, there's actually 2 sets of multiple choice questions for Chapter 2. The first set is like basic object-oriented programming stuff. And then the second set of multiple choice questions has to do with methods of a string class. So I won't assign that one yet. I'll come up with some little mini activities for us to do that involve the use of the methods of the string class before I reassign that one as well. Okay? So those will be just some homework assignments and will be good reinforcement of some of the old topics. Again, is there anything else that you would like to see at this time? Will we have a review sometimes later from the start? What do you mean by that, Kevin? I'm a little confused by that question. Can you rephrase that? Yes, so I mean we've already started our review. You know, what we've done this week what we did, last week and this week pretty much covers everything in Chapter 2 and Chapter 5. So Chapter 5 is all things related to writing a class. Okay? So we've in effect reviewed everything. Chapter 2 is object-oriented programming concepts. You need to know those in order to write a full class. So we've in effect covered pretty much all of Chapter 2 and Chapter 5 in this last week. Chapter 3 has to do with string stuff, so we're going to focus on that next. And then Chapter 4, I believe, is conditional statements, or that might be in Chapter 3 rather. Chapter 4, I think, is loops. Chapter 5 was writing the classes. Chapter 6 was arrays, and then Chapter 7 was array lists. So that's that's basically our whole our whole class. I'm hearing different things. I'm not exactly sure what the types of questions are going to be like that you see on your AP exam. I'm hearing rumors that it might only be FRQs, that you might get 4 FRQs and you might get or I don't know, 3 FRQs in 45 minutes or an hour or something like that to do it. I don't know. I really don't know, but that's what I've heard so far as a rumor. But more information will be released, I think, either tomorrow or sometime this week about specifically what types of questions they're going to ask. So you want to take a look at the salary cap real quick. Let's see. Yep, I suppose you could make the salary cap static, although mine is not, with the cap space. So in the roster class, I didn't have any static variables or static methods. In fact, I don't think you would want cap space to be static, because the amount of cap space that each team, that each roster list object is going to have is going to be different, right? So if one roster has, let's say, 8 players that each make $1 million, or not $1 million. If one roster, it's not something that's going to encompass data for the entire class. It's going to represent certain data for each individual roster, not the entire class. What did I write? Okay. All right then. Anything else for today? Yeah, Jai, that's a good question. I thought based on our previous, what we had seen in our textbook, that object.remove index was the only way that you could use the remove method. But here we're doing, it allowed us to do object.remove object.